The floorboard creaks under my weight, too loud. My fingers dig into the rotted insulation, clawing at the jammed safe before Mom gets home. The envelope's in there. My stolen acceptance letter, my future. Mike's voice hisses from the window. Sheriff's car just turned the corner. The lock snaps free. Too late. The door crashes open. Higgins isn't here to help. His hands grab my collar, slamming me into the wall. The mail scatters, proof of everything they've taken. I swing. My fist connects. But his grip tightens. You were never leaving this town, boy. The iron crowbar bit into the mahogany frame of the floorboard with a dry, splintering shriek. Caleb Miller gripped the cold metal, his knuckles white against the rust-flecked handle. Dust motes danced in the stale air of Martha's study, smelling of old lavender and decaying paper. He shoved his weight downward. The wood groaned, yielding an inch, exposing the dull steel edge of the safe buried beneath the floor. Sweat stung Caleb's eyes. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve, leaving a streak of grime. He couldn't afford a mistake, not now. Every second he spent in this room felt like a cord tightening around his throat. This house, with its lace doilies and the oppressive scent of Martha's floral perfume, had always been a cage. Today, he was breaking the lock. "Hurry up," Mike whispered, his voice cracking like dry kindling. He stood pressed against the heavy velvet curtains, peeking through a sliver of glass at the quiet Oak Haven street. A siren wailed 3 blocks over, the sound rising and falling like a rhythmic bruise. Mike's hand trembled on the latch. "They're circling the block again, Cal. I can see the lights reflecting off the neighbor's fence." "Shut up and watch the street," Caleb snapped, though his own heart hammered a frantic tattoo against his ribs. He wedged the tip of the bar into the gap between the safe's lid and the frame. He strained, his breath hitching. The physical resistance of the metal felt like his mother's own stubborn will. The lock mechanism clicked, a hollow metallic snap that echoed through the silent house. Caleb dropped to his knees, his fingers fumbling with the heavy lid. The scent of grease and cold copper wafted up as the door swung wide. Inside sat a single manila envelope, thick and tied with twine. This was the leverage, the only currency left to buy his way out of the city's grip. He reached in, his calloused fingers brushing against the rough paper. As he pulled the bundle out, the twine snapped. A dozen envelopes spilled onto the dusty floor. Caleb froze. He recognized the logo in the top left corner immediately. A blue shield, the crest of Duke University. His breath hitched. These weren't just papers. They were ghosts. He picked one up, the paper crisp and expensive looking. It was addressed to him, dated 3 years ago. "Dear Mr. Miller, we are pleased to inform you." Caleb's vision blurred. He ripped open another, and another. Each one was a variation of the same theme. Acceptance letters, scholarship offers, housing assignments. There were even final notice letters asking why he hadn't responded to his full-ride financial aid package. All this time, he'd believed he wasn't good enough. He'd spent 3 years working double shifts at the garage, grease under his fingernails, and a permanent ache in his lower back, thinking he was a failure who had been rejected by the world. Martha had told him the letters never came. She'd sat him down at the kitchen table with a glass of sweet tea and told him that sometimes Oak Haven is the only place that truly wants us, Caleb. The betrayal was a physical weight, a cold stone in his gut. She hadn't just lied. She had stolen his life before it even started. He began stuffing the envelopes into his jacket, his movements frantic and jerky. "Cal, we gotta go," Mike hissed, spinning away from the window. "The headlights. They stopped at the gate. It's the cruiser. It's Higgins." Caleb didn't move for a heartbeat. He stared into the empty belly of the safe. The 4-tap rhythm started involuntarily on his right thigh. 1, 2, 3, 4. He was reset. He was cold. He stood up, the Duke letters crinkling against his chest, and turned toward the door. Subverted Phase 1. Smart decision. Caleb didn't panic. He knew the layout of the house better than anyone, and he knew Sheriff Bill Higgins. Higgins was a creature of habit, a man who relied on the weight of his badge and the length of his shadow to intimidate. Caleb decided the smartest move was to stand his ground in the study. If he tried to run out the back, he'd be caught in the floodlights of the driveway. But here, surrounded by the evidence of Martha's crimes, he had the upper hand. He would present the letters to Higgins. Higgins was a lawman. Even in a town as tight-knit as Oakhaven, identity theft and mail fraud were federal offenses. Caleb gripped the manila folder firmly. Logic dictated that once a peace officer saw the proof of a felony, the dynamic would shift. He was the victim. Martha was the criminal. He just had to remain calm and let the evidence speak. Phase 2. False positive. The front door creaked open, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots. 8, 9, 10. Higgins' voice drifted up the stairs, counting the steps as he always did. The door to the study swung wide, and the sheriff stood there, a mountain of a man in a tan uniform that looked a size too small. He didn't draw his weapon. He just sighed, looking at the pry bar and the open floorboards. "Caleb," Higgins said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Son, what have you done?" Caleb held up the Duke letters. "She stole them, Bill. Look at the dates. She's been intercepting my mail for 3 years. This is fraud. I need you to take these and file a report." Higgins stepped into the room, his expression softening into something resembling pity. He reached out and took the top envelope, scanning it under the dim light of the desk lamp. He nodded slowly. "I see. This is a lot to take in, Caleb. Your mother, she's a complicated woman. She does things out of love, even if they're wrong-headed." He tucked the letter into his belt. "You did the right thing, calling it out. Why don't you give me the rest of that bundle? I'll take it down to the station, put it in the evidence locker, and we'll figure out how to straighten this out without causing a scandal at the church." Caleb felt the tension drain from his shoulders. The air in the room suddenly felt breathable. Higgins was being reasonable. He was going to help. Caleb handed over the thick manila folder, feeling the weight of 3 years of misery finally leaving his hands. Phase 3. The crack. Higgins took the folder, but he didn't put it in his portable file case. Instead, he gripped it by the corner and began to tap it against his palm. The rhythm was off. It wasn't the steady beat of a man preparing for paperwork. It was the impatient twitch of someone waiting for a clock to run out. "Where's the boy?" Higgins asked, his eyes scanning the shadows behind the velvet curtains. "The Davis kid. I saw his bike in the bushes." Caleb frowned. He ran. He was scared. "But Bill, about the letters. We need to talk about the power of attorney forms I found, too. She's trying to sign for me." Higgins didn't look at the letters. He looked at Caleb's hands, then at the crowbar on the floor. A small, cold smile touched the corners of his mouth, a look that didn't reach his eyes. "You know, Caleb, breaking and entering is a serious charge, even if it's your own mother's house, especially when you're in an agitated state like this." Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Higgins didn't put the folder in his bag. He dropped it onto the floor and ground his heavy boot into the center of the Duke crest. "You think I didn't know about these?" Higgins stepped forward, his massive chest invading Caleb's personal space. He smelled of stale coffee and gun oil. "Who do you think has been pulling these envelopes from the post office box for her? Martha doesn't have the stomach for the dirty work. She just provides the motivation." Caleb lunged for the folder, but Higgins was faster. The sheriff's hand shot out, grabbing Caleb by the throat and slamming him back against the mahogany desk. The air left Caleb's lungs in a pained wheeze. "Martha told me you'd been acting out," Higgins hissed, his face inches from Caleb's. "Said you were getting ideas again. She was worried you might hurt yourself or her. And look at you. Caught red-handed, breaking into a safe, stealing her private documents. My deputy is out front right now, writing up the report of a home invasion. Your friend Mike? He's a witness to your breakdown. That's why he ran, Caleb. He knew you'd finally snapped." The truth hit Caleb like a physical blow to the solar plexus. This wasn't a discovery. It was a trap. The sheriff wasn't the law. He was the muscle. By handing over the letters, Caleb hadn't secured evidence. He had surrendered his only shield. He looked down at Higgins' belt and saw the silver-plated mirror Martha always carried. It was tucked into the sheriff's utility pouch. They were a team. "You're not going to Duke, Caleb," Higgins whispered, his grip tightening until sparks danced in Caleb's vision. "You're going to the county annex for a psych evaluation. And by the time you get out, Martha will have that power of attorney signed, sealed, and delivered. You'll never have to worry about making a decision for yourself ever again." Caleb's hand brushed the crowbar on the desk. He didn't think. He swung. The cold iron connected with Higgins' ribs with a sickening thud. The sheriff grunted, his grip loosening just enough for Caleb to squirm free. Caleb scrambled for the folder, his fingers screaming as he snatched the papers from under Higgins' boot. He didn't look back. He dived through the open window, the lace curtains tearing as he tumbled into the damp pine needles of the garden. The rain had started, a low, insistent drizzle that made the world smell of wet earth and rot. Caleb sprinted toward the fence, the Duke letters clutched to his chest like a wounded bird. Behind him, he heard Higgins' gravelly voice echoing out of the study window, counting. 1, 2, 3. The hunt was on. Caleb scrambled over the chain-link fence, the metal wire snagging his jeans and biting into his palm. He hit the pavement on the other side and didn't stop, his boots slapping against the asphalt. He needed to find Mike. He needed to get to the warehouse. He reached the end of the block and ducked into the shadows of an overgrown hedge just as a cruiser rolled past, its blue and red lights painting the wet leaves in nauseating pulses. He waited, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his finger tapping the 4-beat rhythm against his thigh. 1, 2, 3, 4. He was alone. The person he'd trusted as the town's protector was the very person helping his mother bury him alive. He made it to the outskirts of the industrial district 20 minutes later. The warehouse where he worked, a hulking mass of corrugated steel and rusted girders, loomed against the gray sky. He saw his truck parked in the gravel lot, a beat-up Ford that was the only thing he truly owned. But as he got closer, his heart sank. The truck was slumped at an angle. He walked around to the driver's side and felt a surge of nausea. All 4 tires had been shredded, the rubber hanging in ribbons. It wasn't a puncture. Someone had used a heavy blade to saw through the sidewalls. "Cal?" A shadow detached itself from the loading dock. Mike stepped into the dim light of a buzzing street lamp, his hoodie pulled low. He was shaking so hard his teeth were chattered. "They're everywhere, man," Mike whispered. "I saw Higgins' car at the house. I thought you were done for." "They're working together, Mike," Caleb said, his voice flat and hard. Higgins and my mother. He's been the one stealing the mail. He tried to kill me back there. Mike's eyes went wide. What do we do? The truck is trashed. We're trapped in the middle of the district. Caleb looked at the shredded tires, then at the warehouse door. We go inside. I have tools in my locker. I have my textbooks. If I can just get enough cash from the emergency stash, we can find a way out of town. In a moment of pure, unadulterated rage, Caleb pulled his phone from his pocket. He didn't think about the risk. He didn't think about the ammo he was giving her. He hit the speed dial for home. Martha answered on the first ring. Her voice was a soft, sugary coo. Caleb? Oh, my sweet boy, where are you? Sheriff Higgins told me you had a terrible accident. He's so worried about your head, lamb. I have the letters, Martha. Caleb spat, his voice trembling with a cocktail of fury and fear. I know everything. I know about Duke. I know about the scholarship. You're a thief. There was a long silence on the other end. When Martha spoke again, the sweetness was gone. It was replaced by a cold, clinical precision. You're at the warehouse, aren't you? I can hear the metal stamper in the background. You always were such a predictable creature, Caleb. So much like your father. Always running to the grease when things got hard. Stay away from me, Caleb said. I'm afraid I can't do that, Martha whispered. A mother's heart is a heavy stone, and mine is sinking. You're sick, Caleb, but don't worry. The doctors are already waiting. Just stay right there. Help is on the way. The line went dead. Caleb stared at the screen, the realization of his mistake washing over him like ice water. He'd given her his location. He'd practically invited the wolves to the door. Inside, Caleb commanded, grabbing Mike by the arm. Now. They fumbled with the heavy steel door of the warehouse. The air inside smelled of burnt dust and machine oil. Caleb reached for the light switch, but when he flipped it, nothing happened. The building remained plunged in a thick, suffocating darkness. The power's out, Mike whimpered. No, Caleb said, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. They cut the lines. He moved toward his locker, his footsteps echoing off the high concrete ceilings. He reached the row of gray metal boxes and yanked his open. He reached for the top shelf where he kept his engineering textbooks, the ones he'd bought with under-the-table cash, hoping to get a head start on the classes he thought he'd never take. His hand met empty space. He reached further, his fingers brushing against something soft and shredded. He pulled out a handful of paper. It was confetti. Hundreds of pages from his thermodynamics and fluid mechanics books had been fed through a heavy-duty industrial shredder. Caleb dropped the paper, watching it flutter to the grease-stained floor like snow. She hadn't just taken his future. She was mocking his attempt to build one. Cal, look. Mike pointed toward the loading dock. Across the vast, dark expanse of the warehouse, the high beam of a spotlight cut through the gloom. Then another. The silhouettes of 3 men appeared in the large bay doors, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the floor. Caleb Miller, a voice boomed. Deputy Taylor. We know you're in here. Come out with your hands up. We don't want to have to come in and get you. Caleb ducked behind a row of industrial shelving, pulling Mike down with him. The shelves were packed with heavy crates of engine parts, the smell of rust and stale coolant thick in the air. We're cornered, Mike hissed. There's no back exit that isn't bolted from the outside. Caleb scanned the room. His mind, trained to see the mechanics of systems, began to map the warehouse. He saw the high-altitude racking, the narrow aisles, and the heavy equipment. We don't need an exit yet, Caleb whispered. We need a bottleneck, He spotted a heavy pallet jack sitting near a stack of wooden crates. It was loaded with nearly 1,000 pounds of unmachined steel castings. "Help me move this," Caleb said. They gripped the handle of the jack, their muscles straining as they began to pump the hydraulic lift. The metal groaned, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to echo in Caleb's teeth. Slowly, they began to drag the massive weight toward the narrow gap between the storage racks. "They're coming down aisle 4, Mike whispered, pointing to the bobbing flashlights. Caleb shoved the pallet jack into the gap, turning the handle so it jammed against the steel uprights of the shelving. It was a perfect barricade. The deputies would have to climb over 1,000 pounds of loose steel or circle back around the entire perimeter of the building. "Go to the emergency ladder in the back corner," Caleb ordered. "The one that leads to the roof. I'll meet you there." "What about you?" "I'm getting the folder," Caleb said, patting his jacket. "And I'm finding out what else she's been hiding." As Mike scrambled into the darkness, Caleb ducked into the foreman's office, a small glass-walled box in the center of the floor. He sat on the floor, hidden by the desk, and pulled out the bundle of mail he'd snatched from the safe. He flicked on a small penlight. The first document wasn't a letter. It was a legal form, bearing a forged version of his own signature. Notice of withdrawal. It was addressed to the Duke admissions office. He flipped to the next. A medical waiver claiming he suffered from severe intermittent explosive disorder and was unable to fulfill the requirements of his scholarship. Again, his name was signed in Martha's elegant, flowing script. The same hand that had taught him how to write his name when he was 5. She hadn't just declined the offers. She had systematically destroyed his reputation with the university, ensuring that even if he did find out, he would be seen as a mental liability. Then he found the final document. It was a power of attorney filing, dated for that very evening. It was a petition for involuntary guardianship. The grounds listed were his deteriorating mental state and repeated instances of violent delusion. If she signed this tonight, he would no longer be a person in the eyes of the law. He would be her property. The sound of a heavy metal door slamming open echoed through the warehouse. "Caleb, I know you're in there." Higgins' voice was closer now. "I can hear you breathing, boy." Caleb shoved the papers back into his jacket. He couldn't go to the roof. The storm was getting worse, and the police had the perimeter surrounded. He needed to get out of the district entirely. He crawled out of the office and slipped into the shadows, moving toward the loading dock. The air was colder now, a biting wind tunneling through the open bay doors. He saw the silhouettes of the cruisers parked in a semicircle, their headlights creating a wall of white glare. Kindness moment. Phase 1. Set up the choice. As Caleb neared the edge of the loading dock, he saw a figure huddled behind a stack of shipping containers. It was Old Man Joe, the warehouse's night watchman. Joe was nearly 80, his eyes clouded with cataracts, and he was currently shivering in a thin flannel shirt. The deputies had shoved him aside when they stormed the building, and Joe had tripped, his leg pinned at an awkward angle under a fallen wooden pallet. Caleb was seconds away from the only blind spot in the police line. If he stopped to help Joe, the deputies would see his movement. The storm was screaming now, and every instinct told Caleb to run, to leave the old man for the police to find later. Joe wasn't his responsibility, and the cost of staying could be his entire life. Phase 2. The helping action. Caleb stopped. He couldn't do it. He couldn't leave another person to be crushed by the order of this town. He dropped to his knees beside Joe. Knees? The old man's skin was cold to the touch, smelling of peppermint and old tobacco. "Easy, Joe," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. He gripped the heavy wooden pallet, It was soaked with rain and oil, weighing nearly 200 pounds. Caleb braced his boots against the concrete and lifted. His back muscles screamed, and the rough wood tore at his palms. But he heaved the weight up just enough for Joe to slide his leg free. Joe let out a soft, whimpering groan. Caleb didn't just leave him there. He took off his own heavy work jacket, the one holding the precious Duke letters, and wrapped it around the old man's shoulders. He leaned in close, his hand steady on Joe's arm. "Listen to me, Joe. You need to crawl toward the office. It's warmer there. Can you do that?" Joe gripped Caleb's hand, his fingers gnarled and weak. "You're a good lad, Caleb. Don't let them break you." Phase 3. Cost and reflection. Caleb watched Joe begin to crawl, then he turned back to the gap in the police line. But it was too late. The delay had cost him the window. A flashlight beam swept across the loading dock, catching the reflective tape on his work boots. There he is. Caleb lunged into the dark, but he had lost his jacket. The Duke letters, the forged waivers, the power of attorney. They were all with Joe now. He had nothing but the clothes on his back and the cold rain hitting his skin. He sprinted into the canyon of shipping containers, his heart heavy. He had lost his evidence. He had lost his leverage. But as he felt the biting wind, he realized his hands were clean for the first time in years. He hadn't acted like a victim. He'd acted like a man. The cost was his freedom, but the price was worth the soul he'd regained. He ran until his lungs burned, weaving through the maze of rusted steel. He found Mike waiting by the perimeter fence, near a muddy logging trail that led away from the main road. "Where's your jacket?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. "Gone," Caleb said. "Get in the truck." Mike had managed to hotwire an old company flatbed that had been left in the back lot. They roared onto the logging trail just as the first bolts of lightning split the sky. The Georgia mud was thick and black, the truck fishtailing as the tires struggled for grip. "We're going to make it," Mike shouted over the roar of the engine. "We'll get to the highway and we'll never look back." But the universe had other plans. As they rounded a sharp bend, the headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was Martha. She stood there in a yellow raincoat, her hair perfectly coiffed despite the downpour. She didn't move. She didn't flinch as the truck skidded to a halt inches from her knees. Caleb stared through the windshield. His mother looked like a specter, her face pale and unblinking in the high beams. She walked to the driver's side door and yanked it open before Caleb could lock it. "Out," she said. The word was a razor blade. "Get away from us, Martha," Mike yelled from the passenger seat. Martha ignored him. She lunged into the cab, her fingers curling into claws as she reached for Caleb's face. She wasn't the martyr anymore. She was a predator. "Give me the folder, Caleb," she shrieked, her voice cracking with a manic energy. "I know you took it. You're not going to ruin this. You're not going to leave me in this house alone." She scratched at his eyes, her fake nails drawing blood across his cheek. Caleb tried to push her back, but she had the strength of a woman possessed. She began to rip at his shirt, searching for the documents she thought he still had. "I don't have them, Martha," Caleb yelled, pinned against the seat. "They're gone. It's over." "It's never over," she screamed. The sound of a siren cut through the thunder. A cruiser pulled up behind the flatbed, its lights blindingly bright in the rain. Subverted Phase 1. Smart decision. Caleb saw the cruiser and felt a surge of desperate hope. This wasn't Higgins' car. It was the second unit driven by Officer David Taylor. Taylor was young, and Caleb knew he'd been bullied by Higgins for months. Caleb decided to stop fighting his mother and put his hands up. He would play the role of the victim perfectly. Martha was currently screaming, her hair disheveled, her hands buried in his collar. It was a clear-cut case of an unprovoked assault by a parent on a child. If he remained passive, Taylor would have no choice but to intervene and separate them. Caleb looked directly into the cruiser's dash cam, making sure his bloodied face was visible. This was the logical endgame. Let the law see the reality of Martha Miller. Phase 2. False positive officer. Taylor stepped out of the car, his rain gear slick and shining. He walked toward the truck, his hand on his holster, but his expression one of deep concern. "Ma'am? Mrs. Miller, please step back," Taylor said, his voice steady. Martha froze. She immediately collapsed against the side of the truck, her face twisting into a mask of pure, heartbreaking agony. "Oh, officer, thank God you're here. He tried to run me over. He's been having a fit. He's not himself." Taylor looked at Caleb, then at the blood on Caleb's face. He reached out a hand to help Caleb out of the cab. "It's okay, Caleb. Just take it easy. We're going to get you some help." I saw her reaching in. I saw the struggle. Caleb stepped out into the mud, his legs shaking. "She attacked me, David. You saw it. She's been forging my name. I know, Taylor said, nodding. He turned back to his cruiser. "I've got the transport unit coming. We'll get this all sorted out at the station. You're safe now." Phase 3. The crack. Caleb leaned against the truck, closing his eyes for a second. The nightmare was ending. But then he heard a sound, the low, rhythmic, gravelly counting of heavy boots in the mud. 11. 12. 13. Caleb's eyes snapped open. Higgins wasn't in the cruiser, but he was walking up the trail from the darkness, his uniform soaked, his face a mask of bruised fury. He didn't look at Martha. He looked at Taylor. "Good work, Deputy," Higgins said. "You caught him in the act." Taylor didn't look surprised. He didn't look conflicted. He looked at the ground, then at Caleb. "I'm sorry, Caleb," he whispered. "I can't. I have a pension to think about." Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. Higgins didn't wait. He grabbed Caleb's arm and spun him around, slamming him face first into the muddy hood of the flatbed. The metal was cold and smelled of wet iron. "Caleb Miller, you're under arrest for the aggravated assault of a senior citizen and the attempted vehicular manslaughter of Martha Miller." Higgins growled, the handcuffs clicking shut with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid closing. "What?" Caleb choked out, his mouth filling with the taste of copper and mud. "She jumped in the car. You saw it, Taylor." Taylor stayed silent, staring at the red taillights of the truck. Higgins leaned down, his breath hot against Caleb's ear. "The dash cam? It was malfunctioning for the last 10 minutes, son. And Taylor here? He's going to testify that he saw you drag your mother into the cab and try to strangle her with your bare hands. You're not a student, Caleb. You're a felon. And felons don't go to Duke. They go to the state farm." Martha stepped forward, her yellow raincoat gleaming like a warning sign. She reached out and gently wiped a streak of mud from Caleb's forehead. Her eyes were bright, almost jubilant. "I told you, lamb," she whispered. "A mother's heart is a heavy stone. And now you're going to help me carry it for a long, long time." They threw him into the back of the cruiser. As the car pulled away, Caleb looked through the wire mesh of the partition. He saw Mike being led away in separate cuffs, and he saw Martha standing in the rain, waving a small white handkerchief as if she were seeing him off on a long-awaited vacation. The Oak Haven police station smelled of industrial bleach and old sweat. Caleb sat in the holding cell, his hands tucked under his armpits to stop the shivering. The walls were white tile, blinding and sterile, reflecting the hum of the fluorescent lights. Higgins had taken everything: his phone, his wallet, and the few loose Duke envelopes he'd managed to keep in his pockets. He was stripped of his identity, reduced to a booking number and a set of bruised ribs. An hour later, the cell door groaned open. Higgins stood there, holding a thick stack of papers. "Your truck's been impounded," Higgins said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "And that folder you were so worried about? The one with the Duke letters? It seems there was a fire in the evidence locker. A real shame. Everything was destroyed." Caleb looked up, his eyes hollow. "You can't burn the truth, Bill." "In this town, I can," Higgins replied. "Martha's outside. She's finished the paperwork for your emergency commitment. You'll be transferred to the Blackwood Institute within the hour. It's a quiet place, lots of trees. You'll have plenty of time to think about why you were so ungrateful." Higgins left, the heavy steel doors slamming shut with a bone-jarring thud. Caleb sat on the hard bunk. He stared at the ceiling, his fingers starting the 4-tap rhythm on his thigh. 1, 2, 3, 4. But this time, the rhythm didn't stop. It evolved. He looked at the vent in the corner of the ceiling. He'd spent 2 weeks in this building last summer, repairing the HVAC system after a freak thunderstorm fried the motors. He knew exactly where those ducts went. He knew that the station was built on an old Victorian foundation, and the crawl space under the floor was a maze of copper pipes and rotting joists. He stood up. He didn't have his tools, but he had his hands. And he had 3 years of manual labor etched into his muscle memory. He climbed onto the bunk and reached for the vent cover. It was secured with 4 standard screws. He didn't have a screwdriver, but he had his belt, the heavy brass buckle he'd won at a local rodeo when he was 16. He used the edge of the buckle as a makeshift driver. The screws were rusted, resisting at first, but Caleb put his shoulder into it. 1, 2, 3, 4. The vent cover came away with a soft, metallic scrape. He pulled himself up into the dark, narrow tunnel. The air was thick with dust and the smell of dead rodents. He crawled on his belly, his chest scraping against the rough metal, his breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts. He reached a junction and turned left, following the hum of the main server room. He found a loose floorboard in the crawl space and dropped down into the darkness beneath the station. He moved like a ghost through the shadows, his hands brushing against cold pipes and damp earth. He reached the rear of the building, where a small service hatch led to the alleyway. He pushed it open and tumbled into the rain. He didn't run for the highway. He ran for the old oak tree near the bus station, the prearranged drop point he and Mike had discussed months ago, back when leaving was just a dream they whispered over cheap beer. He reached the tree and dug into the hollow of the trunk. His fingers met something cold and hard. A plastic-wrapped USB drive. Mike had been smart. He'd made digital scans of every letter, every forged signature, and every bank statement he'd found while hacking into Martha's accounts. Caleb gripped the drive. He had the evidence. Now he needed a witness. He walked into the bus station, his clothes soaked, his face a map of bruises. He saw Officer David Taylor sitting at the small coffee counter, his head in his hands. Taylor looked up, his face turning pale as he saw Caleb. "Caleb? How did you—" Caleb didn't give him a chance to speak. He walked over and slammed the USB drive onto the counter. "I know you're not a bad man, David," Caleb said, his voice low and vibrating with a strange, calm intensity. "I know Higgins has his boot on your neck. But look at me. Look at what they're doing. Taylor looked at the drive, then at Caleb's eyes. "My father didn't die in a car wreck," Caleb said. "Mike found the records. He's alive in Seattle. Martha's been cashing his support checks for 20 years. She's been using my social security number to take out loans. She's stolen over $200,000, David. And Higgins has been taking a 30% cut to keep the mail coming to his private box." Caleb pushed the drive toward him. "You can take me back to that cell, or you can be the cop you told me you wanted to be when we were kids. You choose." The silence in the bus station was deafening, broken only by the hum of the vending machines and the rain against the glass. Taylor looked at the drive. He looked at the red folder Caleb had pulled from his pocket, the one Joe had managed to hide and return to him. The color made Taylor flinch, but he didn't look away. Slowly, Taylor reached out and took the drive. "Get on the 4:15 to Atlanta," Taylor whispered, his voice shaking. "Don't look back. I'll take this to the district attorney in the morning. Higgins doesn't own the DA." Caleb didn't say thank you. He couldn't. He just nodded and walked toward the boarding gate. As he stepped onto the bus, he saw a familiar yellow raincoat pulling into the parking lot. Martha stepped out, her silver mirror in hand, her eyes scanning the crowd with a frantic, hungry desperation. The bus engine roared to life, a deep, rhythmic vibration that drowned out the sound of the rain. Caleb sat in the back row, leaning his head against the cold glass. He watched as Martha saw him through the window. She screamed something, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. But the glass was thick, and her voice was lost to the wind. The bus pulled away, the lights of Oakhaven fading into a blur of gray and blue. Caleb reached into his bag and pulled out a heavy, brand-new textbook, Principles of Structural Engineering. He opened the front cover. The paper smelled of fresh ink and hope. He took a pen from his pocket and, in a steady, clear hand, wrote his name on the inside cover. Caleb Miller. He didn't tap his thigh. He didn't look for the exit. He just started to read. The road to Atlanta was long, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, painting the horizon in shades of gold and fire. For the first time in 22 years, Caleb Miller was exactly where he was supposed to be. He was free,